Hi, everyone, and welcome to this plus Acumen Learning Lab on lean data approaches to measure social impact. My name is Danielle Sutton, and I'm the content animator for Plus Acumen. And if you aren't already familiar, Plus Acumen is the world's school for social change, and we offer over 30 free and low-cost courses that have been taken by over 450 changemakers around the world. And our library includes a free course on lean data, exactly what you're here to learn about today. But we have the extra pleasure of welcoming Sasha Dichter to present this learning lab with you guys today. Sasha is the co-founder of 60 Decibels and the former Chief Innovation Officer at Acumen. And Sasha helped create Lean Data and Plus Acumen and led the Acumen Fellows program. So a wealth of history with Acumen and Plus Acumen in general. So we're super excited to have you here to go into more depth. And just as extra context, which Sasha will share more about his work, but 60 Decibels, the organization that he leads now, was created as a social enterprise and spun out of Acumen this year for the purpose of bringing the lean data approach to the world, to even more people. So today, Sasha will walk you through how to use lean data to hear directly from the people you aim to serve, and super excited to get started. Just a couple housekeeping items before I pass it over. Please let us know in the chat where you're joining from. I see a lot of you are already sharing, which is great. And please also post your questions in the chat as we go, and then we'll have some time at the end to answer some of your questions. And we'll also be sending out a replay with the full recording after the fact. So you can keep an eye on your email for that a few hours after we wrap up. So that's it for now. I will pass it over to you, Sasha.
Great. Sounds good. Thank you very much, Danielle. With my old Acumen hat, I think you said 450 people have taken Plus Acumen courses, but I'm guessing it was 450,000. So a little more exciting still.
Sorry.
Great.
Good catch.
Anyway, thank you everyone for joining. I saw, I think, Swaziland, Zambia, Seattle, Calgary, Minnesota, and New York, and I'm sure everywhere else in between. It's a real pleasure to be here. What we'll do today is talk a little bit about social impact measurement more broadly. We'll give a little bit of context of how and why we created lean data. Talk a little bit about what our approach is and what problems it does and doesn't solve. And then in the end, go into a little bit of technique. Next slide. Go into a little bit of detail on some tips and tricks that might be helpful. Obviously, we're not going to in 30 minutes teach everybody to be a practitioner of gathering customer data, but a few thoughts that might help you along your way. So that's what we're going to do. I will go through these slides probably for about 20 or 30 minutes and then do Q&A. So I hope you have questions and I'll try to have answers to make sure that we're answering the things that are important to you. So to start at the beginning in the broad space, I will talk in general about I'll probably use impact investing language, not because what we do is only relevant to impact investing, but rather just because Acumen, as an impact investor, is the context in which we built lean data. But what we do and what we're going to be talking about here in terms of what lean data can do is applicable to any situation in which you have beneficiaries or customers for whom you're trying to create a social impact. But the context on impact measurement that I'm going to share will be from impact investing and probably less focused on other sectors. But to start out, this is a statement made by the G7 task force on impact investing, that impact measurement is the backbone of impact investing. I think to anybody who is in the space, they would have seen this statement as aspirational at best, and maybe not particularly accurate at worst. Impact measurement is not the backbone of impact investing. I think it could be, and I think it should be, a backbone, because ultimately our job is not just to deploy capital into social enterprises or deploy capital into NGOs. Our job is to make positive change. And there's no way to know if you're making positive change if you don't measure it. So I hope we will get to the point where this feels true and real at some future date. That's part of the reason that we created 60 Decibels, because we didn't think there were solutions that were useful and robust enough to actually become this backbone, but it will take some time to get there. Second is a piece of context that I think is important framing for a lot of what we'll talk about here, which is to understand why you are measuring. One of the things that we have observed is more often than not measurement, and this applies in impact investing, but it also applies, I would say, very strongly in international development, in aid and philanthropy, is that the why of impact measurement tends to be about value creation and accountability between the limited partner, the investor, the person who puts up the money, and the general partner or the NGO, the investor, the person who runs the fund. So often the history of measurement, the history of measurement evaluation is for the people who hold the money to learn and to hold accountable about whether or not that money was spent in the way it was meant to be spent and whether or not good things are happening. And while it is understandable that that accountability would drive a lot of things, and it's good to have that accountability, the challenge is that there's a lot of loss of kind of fidelity or reality between all the steps in this chain. And so more often than not, when an impact strategy from a funder goes all the way down to the company, to the customer, it is so different from that reality that it seems almost irrelevant. And so our view, kind of philosophically, in terms of what we think is needed in impact measurement, is first and foremost to anchor impact measurement around the company or the nonprofit and the customer or beneficiary, and find ways for measurement to create value between the two of them. So find a way to have measurement create value for the customer, and find measurement to find a way to make it easier for the company or for the NGO to serve that customer better and create more social impact. And our belief is that if you optimize your measurement for that interaction, then the general partner, the limited partner will also get the data that they need. But more often than not, this is a top-down thing that is imposed. And that creates a whole set of power dynamics and a whole set of focus that is away from what matters for customers, which what we think at 60 decibels is problematic. So with that as context, then I'm going to share some perspective on common approaches to impact and measurement that we've seen play out in impact investing in particular. So there's 4 that I'll talk through. One is kind of organizing and screening tools. One is focusing on operational data. One is looking at third-party research or proxies. And the 4th is just ask the company. And for those of you who have been in the impact investing or social enterprise space, a number of these will seem familiar. So the first one is organizing and screening tools. So these are things like GEARS, the SDGs, the IMP. We love acronyms in this space. The IMP is the Impact Management Project, which incidentally was conceived of and created by Clara Barbie, who is the CEO of the Impact Management Project, because I'm another Acumen alum, so we feel some connection to that. But these various approaches are powerful as a starting point. So what they're particularly good at is communicating strategy, organizing existing data, maybe simplifying complexity. So for example, the IMP will help an investor identify to their funders what of various strategies they're employing. A GEARS report will organize a lot of data around policies and procedures that a company has to make it clear to folks who care about that particular set of things how they operate the company. But none of these in and of themselves necessarily measures impact. So for example, if you think, I get the question all the time whether or not 60 decibels aligns with the SDGs. And SDG number 1 is to eliminate poverty. So if you, essentially anything you're doing could probably be applicable to SDG number 1. So it's helpful to know as an organizing principle what SDG you align to, or what practices you have in a GEARS report, or what type of fund you are aligned with the impact management project. But none of those actually tells you about impact performance. As you can see on this particular slide, there is actually a 5-star rating for this individual company or this individual fund, even though actual data around what happens to the people who are being served by this company or fund isn't present nowhere in this GEARS report. So that's a problem. The other thing to just say as a passing thought is, of these various approaches, we have done the most work with the Impact Management Project, the IMP, and we find that to be a very, very effective framework for thinking about and classifying social impact. And so I would recommend that one if you're trying to choose one. Number 2 is operational data. And this is really important if you are a consumer of information about social impact. So it is very common to see a social impact report that looks like this one here, and it's going to talk about livelihoods created, money that's put into people's pockets, all these sorts of things. And as you can see on the left-hand side, the way this is done is to count the number of outputs, so in this case 42,000 and something solar home systems, to understand an average social impact metric for each solar home system, and then compute how many hours of light or how many dollars got into people's pockets, etc. So it's good for understanding how many people are reached. It's obviously good for marketing communication. But unfortunately, it is assuming that every company in your portfolio that has one business model has the exact same social impact per unit sold. So every solar home system has the same impact. Where in reality, of course, most companies are not average. There's lots of variation. And so as a result, what we have is lots of data being transmitted describing what the impact, I would describe this as, could be. I think this is the potential impact for this fund. But there's actually no work going on in many cases to understand what the impact is, in fact, on the ground. And unfortunately, more often than not, the assumed impact is a lot greater than the actual impact. And the difference in those two things is experienced by the end customers whose lives are not improving as much as they would like and as much as the fund would like or would like to represent. So again, I would encourage everyone to be intelligent consumers of this kind of content and look and ask yourself when you read these headline numbers, what math did they do to get to those numbers? And more often than not, it is math, it is not customer level data that is driving those numbers. Approach number 3, external data sources. So here's one example from Prism in India, but there's lots of these where you're getting existing data on populations or existing data on satellite data, all these sorts of things. Again, this is very helpful to understand context, to understand where you might want to deploy capital. But again, there's 2 risks. Again, one is there maintains this risk, and obviously this is a theme of not actually getting data from the people who are the customers or the beneficiaries and understanding what's happening for them. But I think the other risk is because this feels kind of sophisticated and nuanced, it does give this sense that there's rich data here and therefore it is sufficient. The data in these databases are varying degrees of accuracy, better in some cases like in health, worse in a lot of other cases. And again, my take and our take at 60 Decibels would be this is a great starting point to figure out how to deploy capital. It's a great starting point to think about your strategy. But that is different than understanding whether or not your impact performance is actually happening and what you would hope it would be. And finally, approach number 4, I would call just ask the company. Oh, shoot. There you go. My lights are back on. Sorry about that. This was a version of what Acumen did from 2001 to 2012. And it wasn't as light as this sounds, but fundamentally our view was that we didn't want to ask companies for any data they couldn't provide, and that we would develop a data plan with each individual company and then have them share their social impact data as well as their financial and operational data aligned with various IRIS metrics. So you select some metrics from the taxonomy, you agree to reporting. In Acumen's case, we got monthly reports from 80 to 100 companies all over the world. However, what we found in the Acumen portfolio was most of the time the companies did not have good data. And so where I say what it's good for is if you have an investing strategy where companies do have well-developed systems for collecting social impact data, then this is an excellent approach. What we found at Acumen, and I would say is the case 9 out of 10 times within impact investing, is the companies don't have this data. We go back to the previous example of the companies have operational data, which one can convert into social impact data, but there's not a lot of capacity. Compliance is often quite low. It can be a nice to have. And fundamentally, this is, again, another way of organizing and repackaging operational data, but not necessarily understanding what performance looks like. And so that was the context in which, up until 2012, Acumen operated. And in that context, when we looked at our own social impact data, we came to the conclusion that it wasn't driving learning. And we weren't helping companies get better, and we weren't, as Acumen, getting better and smarter about what it takes to create social impact. And that conclusion is actually what led us to start developing what then became Lean Data. So that's chapter 1 of our story. I'll switch now to chapter 2. get into more detail about what lean data is, the problems it does and doesn't solve, give you a little bit of a flavor for some of the results that we're able to get. And then I'll get on quickly to chapter 3, which is some tips and tricks for your own social impact measurement. So what we're trying to do with 60 decibels and our lean data approach is to make it easy to listen to the people who matter most. And how we do that is mostly through mobile data collection. We experimented with a lot of things in late in 2013 and 2014 of easiest, efficient, fast, light ways to get customer data. Because one of the things that we know is if this is heavy and burdensome and slow, it will never be useful to companies and therefore never be useful to customers. And that was one of our first principles. So we did a lot of testing of mobile phones and whether or not we could collect good data either by SMS or by voice. And we found that we could. We now mostly do voice surveys. The way we do that is we have about 190 researchers in 38 countries all over the world. We recruit them ourselves and train them actually in partnership with Plus Acumen for some training that we've developed to get them up to speed to be capable to do lean data surveys. And then most importantly, we have spent a lot of time developing really high quality questions in various sectors in which we operate. And this is a really important thing that is most often overlooked in our space, which is to get good, reliable, consistent data, you need good, reliable, and consistent questions. And we have spent a huge amount of time testing and developing and refining questions until we get to a point where we have standard questions for all of the sectors in which we're gathering data. And once we have standard questions, that allows us to actually benchmark social impact performance in ways we really couldn't before. And that ultimately is one of the most important things, is being able to not only collect good data, but create meaning out of that data. And meaning, part of the way that meaning comes is by understanding your own performance relative to other peer organizations that are trying to do similar things. So in detail, what does that mean is, and I mentioned some of these things, quality remote surveying, we've got enumerators all over the world, as I said, awesome questions and question sets, and finally analysis and synthesis, and I'll talk through some of these things in more detail. I think we've talked about some of these things, but I guess the only thing that I would add is also speed is really important. So we want to make social impact measurement and listening to customers to feel much more like market research and customer intelligence and feel much less like an academic study. And so that means is when we work with a company, from the time we speak to the first customer to the time we're delivering results, takes about 6 weeks, maybe as long as 8 weeks. We feel like, and we have found that that speed is necessary to have companies make decisions and use that data in any real sorts of ways. As a point of comparison, as you all probably know, an academic study and evaluation will at a minimum take a year, but more often take 3 to 4 years. And clearly that's designed for a different purpose. That's designed for learning, that's designed for funders, designed for knowledge, all of which are important things. But it will be a very rare situation in which a formal evaluation will be used in a monthly, quarterly way by an operating organization to better serve its customers. So for a little bit of data on ourselves, in a typical project, we speak to 200 to 300 customers. So you obviously done a lot of those because we've spoken to more than 100,000 customers all over the world. You can see on the left the languages in which we're speaking to them. We mostly use phone calls, and I'll talk a little more about why we use phone and voice rather than SMS and other sorts of things. Importantly, our surveys are really short. We try to keep them at 30 questions or fewer. Sometimes they extend up to 40, but we want to have a good experience for the customer. And part of that means not keeping them on the phone for 2 hours, which wouldn't work, but is much more typical, a 2-hour in-person interview. And as I said, a short project duration and great feedback from folks in terms of our own Net Promoter Score. This is, the range for Net Promoter Score is negative 100 to 100. And so our Net Promoter Score from our clients is 74, which makes us very happy. This is a little bit of a sense of the folks that we're working with, so I won't spend too much time on this, but as you can see, it's mostly impact investors, foundations, and corporations, as well as some NGOs directly. Sorry about the lights, folks, but they keep turning off. And these are some sectors that we work in. Off-grid energy, agriculture, education, and financial inclusion are the biggest ones. And as you can see, in each of these sectors, we have between 50 and 150 studies that we've completed, which makes our benchmarks really strong and powerful. And we get to the point where we can say in any of these sectors, not only how an individual fund or social enterprise is performing, but also, again, how their performance compares to their peers on the social impact that they're creating. As you can see, we're also doing a lot of additional work and in growing amount of work in gender, in good jobs and job quality, health, housing, etc. And have started recently to work a lot more in supply chains, both for foods as well as for garments and other sorts of things. A typical lean data project is, again, a focused engagement where we're going to talk to 200 to 300 customers over the course of about 8 weeks, mostly by phone. And importantly, the other thing to mention is we place a lot of emphasis on open-ended qualitative questions. Again, our job is to listen, and part of the way we listen is to let people talk. And we let them talk by almost all the time when there's a quantitative question, asking them, and why did you give that answer? And if there's a recommendation I could give, even if you're going to do this yourself on a small scale, is to not simply have quantitative questions, because we need to understand the why, and we need to understand whether our assumptions are correct. Of course, what that means is when you get qualitative responses, you need to figure out a way to analyze them and code them, and that is a bigger lift. But it is a really important thing for getting rich data. And then to give you then a sense of kind of the assessment, just like I did for the other 4 approaches, of what we think we do well and what we don't do well. This on the left is an output for of our client of ours. You can see a perception of changes in quality of life from very much improved to got worse. But what we feel like we do best is working with people who are making direct investments that have customers, so usually best for B2C. We do some B2B as well, but mostly B2C with a social purpose. To get customer level impact, to compare performance, to integrate feedback and learning, and importantly, to populate whatever your framework is. So if you want to align to the SDGs, to the IMP, to whatever other framework, whether it's in microfinance or other sectors, we are trying to help you get the data you want to populate that framework. What we don't do as well is work with non-customers. And so, for example, I'm sorry, I have a question for Danielle. My own face is above my slide, so I can't really see what this says on the bottom right. But I believe what it says, yeah, Danielle, is there a way for me to move that?
Yeah, if you just turn off your camera at the top, then you'll be able to see. There we go.
Can you still see me or no?
Not yet. So if you want to turn yourself back on after this slide.
I see.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Got it. Okay, so anyway, yes. So, for example, if you're in the environmental space, if you're in the policy space, if customers are not at the core of what you're doing, what we're doing, our lean data approach is probably not as appropriate. And to be very clear, we're not going to solve all measurement challenges for all asset classes. We're really optimized for that direct investor who wants to understand what's going on with their customers. Now I'll turn my camera back on. So this is just a snapshot of some of the deliverables that we give, trying to make it very rich and vibrant in terms of data and that people can grab onto. The other thing that we do a lot of is work at the level of a fund. So that could be an Acumen, a Meteor, Global Partnerships, a Kenny Arth, etc., and giving them comparable data for all of the investments that they have in their fund. So these are examples of comparable poverty-focused comparisons in social impact across various business models and the like. And we find more often than not that that comparison is really powerful for folks in terms of learning new things that they didn't understand about the investments that they're making. And then obviously we do some external work as well, and we'll share some of these links later, but this is an example of a piece of work that we've done with Omidyar. And the point, I show this just to show that even though we're getting really detailed customer data, it still is important to be able to communicate that all up in a really simple and boiled down way, and that's one of the things that we're trying to make easier for folks. So if you want to learn more, here's some other sources that you can learn more. A white paper that we've written, Stanford Social Innovation Review article, a lean data field guide, the energy impact report that we did with Acumen, Harvard Business School cases on lean data and the like. There's a lot out there if you'd like to learn more in addition to the Plus Acumen course. And then finally, chapter 3. Let's get into the details. This does feel like a lot of me talking, but hopefully where everyone is hopefully it makes sense to cover all this at once, and then we'll go into Q&A as the last thing. So getting into the details, I just wanted to leave everyone with some tips about how to think about actually deploying any sort of customer survey work that you might want to do. So first and foremost, just wanted to cover the kinds of things that we do well, the kinds of questions in general that we answer. So who are my beneficiaries? Poverty level, gender, obviously location, other sorts of things, but any demographic data that you might want to gather. Overall, what do they think of me? This is where open-ended questions are really valuable. Why do they come to me, whether as a customer or as a beneficiary? Do they hear from me? Do they hear from sales agents? Do they hear from their friends or family members? What do they think can improve? Obviously, what outcomes are they experiencing? We spend most of our time trying to gather this data. And finally, how do I compare to competitors or how do I compare to other providers? So that's just a general headline. And then the second point that I want to cover is how to think about organizing whatever questions you ask and also whatever results you present. Ultimately, for this sort of data to be useful and used by people, it needs to be easy to get to. And the kinds of people you want to consume this data will come from all different parts, whether of a company, a social enterprise, an investor, etc. So we have found that the best way for us to organize our narrative on what we're learning is to follow a beneficiary or a customer journey. So who are they? How are they acquired? What's their experience? What's the impact that they're getting from the product or service? And then how do we keep them as happy, satisfied, again, customers or beneficiaries? And so what this means is if you're thinking about asking questions, you could use this 5-step process as an organizing principle. So for example, this is just an example for an after-school program. Or I think this might have been a workforce training, but regardless. So who are the students you're trying to reach? You may have a thesis that you're reaching particularly underserved customers, customers who don't have access, people from a certain income level. You want to gather data to see if you're serving the people you want to serve. Again, how are they acquired? Why did they decide to come and work with you? What challenges are their experience? How satisfied are they? What are the outcomes? So this is a set of questions that you could very specifically ask yourself. So you can begin to figure out what questions you actually want to ask, make sure you're complete about those questions, and really think about every aspect of that student's journey with you as a service provider. And so obviously the findings we would come out of this would be a lot more detailed, but just want to make sure that everybody leaves this with a more concrete sense of what this might look like. So in this case, you have students who tend to be 17 or 18, mostly women, who they live with. They heard about it from teachers. They want to improve their math skills. This is what their experience is, what they like in terms of curriculum, what the impact has been, and whether or not they'll come back. Needless to say, this is incredibly simplified, but you can see how having all of these various pieces of data would help you understand who's coming, why they come, what's happening for them, how are we going to keep them engaged, and all of this data. When we find that when we organize it this way, it's much easier for people to figure out what actions to take and what steps they can take to continue to serve the people they want to serve as well as possible. Tip number 3 is about writing good questions. We love writing good questions. We spend all our time poring over questions and trying to make sure they can be as good as possible. What I would say overall is question writing is an art. It is not a science. But the other thing that's been surprising to us is as we've started to focus more and more on writing good questions, we realize there's almost no resources out there for how to do this. So it does take a lot of practice. But some tips to do and not to do. So first is a good question is not leading. So things like, don't you think our company is great is a terrible question, but there are less obvious versions of that in which somehow if you read the question, it is implying a certain answer, and obviously that's going to bias your results. Secondly, a good question is simple and coherent. This is probably the most important tip. So anything that has multi-part question, multi-parts is really more than one question, but also questions that are just hard to answer. If you ask me what I had for lunch last Wednesday, I frankly have no idea. And so recall is terrible if it's going too far back. If you ask me what I had for breakfast this morning, I can answer that question. And so even having that very basic test of, is this something that someone can recall? We see this a lot in agriculture, where you're asking a farmer 7 months after they planted how much fertilizer they used. Now, if they use the same amount of fertilizer every single year, that's not a bad question. But if it varies a lot, they may not know the answer to that particular question and what they did, half a year ago. Third is a good question, avoids judgment. There's a famous story about IBM who, I think 20 plus years ago, asked a question along the lines of, would you buy a environmentally conscious computer that uses less power? And something like 90% of people said they would. When they made the computer, nobody actually bought it. And the reason is because you seem like a bit of a jerk if you said you wouldn't buy the greener, better for the planet computer. And so those questions that require the user to describe themselves and whether or not they're good people or not. They tend to be poor questions because, again, you're not going to get an unbiased answer. I mentioned before one question. Multi-part questions are terrible. Short and sweet is the same thing. And try to keep it fun. We're all accustomed to this idea in an interview. Does somebody pass the Philadelphia airport test? Is this just a person I enjoy talking to? Similarly, read through your survey and ask whether or not answering these questions would be fun or engaging or a real drag. And obviously specificity. And then finally, I'll just quickly about good surveys. Obviously, qualitative and quantitative we talked a lot about, so I won't spend any more time on that. Secondly, you're going to lose people at the end, so once you're done with your entire survey, really decide what's most important and put that up front. And obviously, as we've been talking about, comparable insights, which means thinking a lot about standardization of your survey, because that will be really valuable in the long run. Last set of tips on method. These are the various methods you could use. You can send emails, you can use voice response, you can use the phone, you can send SMSs, and obviously you can do things in person. Just want to give people a sense of what these various methods cost, why you might use one or the other. We often will use them together. So we will often use SMS in advance of a phone call to let people know a phone call is coming, to let them schedule the phone call, to thank people afterwards. As I've said before, we started a lot with SMS, but when we started doing voice, even though each individual response is considerably more expensive, the data was so much better that we really focused on voice question and people talking to people. I don't personally believe that automated voice surveys is a good experience for end consumers, and until the technology changes radically, it's not going to be a major part of what we do, even though it's much less expensive. Finally, on analysis, I don't really have any tips, but just to let people know what they're in store for. Once you get data and it looks like this, what you need to do is be able to turn that data into something that looks like this. And I only mention that to say that the analysis step is where a lot of organizations really get tripped up. Gathering data is itself, can be easy, can be difficult, but turning that data into insights is a skill. And what we find time and time again is that building that skill at each and every company is not necessarily easy, and that's where partnering with an outside provider, whether it's a 60 Decibels or somebody else, can really help get those insights into the hands of people who need them in a way that they'll be able to act on them. And so before we close, this is my very last slide, but I happened to write a blog post this week about boiling social impact down to one number, and wanted to share just a story. I find often, being in the everyday weeds, as I am, of social impact measurement, that a lot of people find social impact measurement hard, challenging, intimidating, and there's this overwhelming desire to simplify it. And sometimes I feel like that desire goes too far. And there's this hope that we can boil all social impact down to one number, whether it's a monetary value or some other thing. And so I was at a conference recently where somebody asked whether or not social impact measurement was like health. And what that person seemed to be implying was, health is really complex. We'll never, really understand all of health with one number. Social impact might be the same thing. We'll never get to comparability. It'll always be opaque. And when I heard that question, my conclusion was that the health analogy was a great analogy, but actually the conclusion was the wrong conclusion. So what do we see in health? When you go to your doctor for a physical or for a checkup, there's a bunch of metrics, numbers, that your doctor will gather from you every time. They're simple, they're universal, they're easy to gather. Your pulse, your blood pressure, your body mass index, etc. Your doctor knows what a good and bad range is for a blood pressure. And however, what she's also doing is she's regularly gathering that primary data. So there'd never be a world in which if I wanted to know how my blood pressure was, I could go to my doctor and she would say to me, well, typically for a person of your age and demographics, the range tends to be from here to here. I want to know my blood pressure. Yet in social impact measurement, what we often say is typically a company like this does this. That was our solar panel example. That's great information to know what the standard is, but we need to know what happens for that individual company. And finally, if you're outside of the range, you'll go deeper for further tests. So that's what normal everyday healthcare looks like. What could that look like for impact measurement? Well, we need some simple universal measures. Who's being served? What's the social impact? How much is that social impact? We use research as a starting point. Just like blood pressure, we know the range. We should really know what the research says about a given intervention. But then we really have to gather the primary data as well. To understand our particular intervention, we need to measure our particular intervention in a way that's easy and light for folks. And then over time, more nuance as you go deeper, right? So we don't need to compare a school to healthcare to financial inclusion, just like we don't need to compare lungs to hearts. But what we need to do is be able to understand overall what social impact looks like, what is comparable and what isn't. So my conclusion, my takeaway from that for all of you would be, let's give up the hunt for one single number. Let's always remember that just like when you go to the doctor and she gathers data from you, we have to speak to customers and beneficiaries if we're going to be serious about social impact. And finally, that we can be comfortable with the simplicity of those high-level numbers and also the complexity that lies underneath that. And we need both of those if we're really going to move the needle on creating the social impact we aim to create. So that's what I've got. That was 30 minutes of me talking. I hope that that all holds together for you, but I will turn it over to Danielle, who I assume has been curating questions, and we'll go from there.
Yes, amazing, Sasha. Thank you so much. That was a ton of great information, and we have a lot of questions that have come in. So we'll get started on those and see how far we get. And if you have more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to them as well. So let's see, where should we start? Maybe more at the higher level in terms of, we did receive a question from Stanford about the differences or similarities between impact measurement and how, especially in the lean data context, and how this could be different or similar from problem solution fit research that people are typically doing with their customers in the early stages.
So there's a risk that I don't answer this question well because I'm not totally familiar with problem solution fit. If that is kind of user-centered design, I'm going to just answer the question as if it is. And Danielle seems to be nodding. So
I would guess. Yeah, but let us know, Stanford, if you have more clarity there.
Yeah. So I think the kind of philosophies of user-centered design and what we're doing with lean data are extremely similar. There's this sense of, we call it lean data for that reason, right? There's a sense of go to customers early, talk to them, listen to them really well in an intensive fashion. So in principle, I think they're quite similar. What we find in practice is more often than not, user-centered design is getting you to the point of figuring out what that product needs to look like and hopefully moving you towards product market fit. What we're trying to do is basically keep that same mentality for the ongoing conversation you need to have with customers around whether or not the overall service experience continues to be what you hoped it would be. So I think, again, without getting into too many details, conceptually they're quite similar. Imagine you are continuing to sort of do user-centered design at the level of the organization and have a methodology that lets that data continue to come in. That's how I would compare them, but obviously one of them is intensively in person and more kind of visual and product oriented, but we're trying to essentially keep those principles and apply them to a new context.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. We had a couple people ask about the combination. So how do you combine lean data with behavioral analysis of customers? I'm not sure.
These questions are winning for super broad. So we have actually done nice pieces of work, some particularly in Ethiopia, to incorporate behavior change research into lean data projects. I guess I would, without getting too much into the details, what I would say is mostly this will boil down to what questions you ask and how you ask them. And so I think that the longer answer to this question is 15 minutes long, but fundamentally, I guess what I would say as a general point is our opportunity, our limitation is to gather data that an end customer can describe themselves verbally, right? So we can't observe people's behavior, obviously. We can talk to them about their behavior, and all of those various tips that I shared about writing good questions should give you a sense of like what works and what doesn't, right? So if you're asking people about behaviors that are aspirational behaviors or that are, seeming morally, do you ever lie? Is probably not a particularly good question. The such and such educational campaign happened. It's clear that you're supposed to say it was great and whatever. Again, not really a good question. So I think it gets into the technique of figuring out what kind of questions you can ask someone that would allow them to describe their behaviors in ways that makes it okay. And so, I have some more thoughts on exactly how you do that, but I guess that's how I would describe it in general. And this is an area in particular where really testing and understanding your questions to make sure you're not introducing bias from day one of, questions that encourage people to say they're doing something that they might not be doing. And it's nuanced. And, I don't think we cracked the nut on it, but we've done some nice work there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I could imagine you could speak for a whole hour about just designing the questions with this type of thing in mind. And leading into a few questions coming in about specifics in the interview process and connecting with customers. Natalie is wondering, how do you identify the customers in the first place to even decide who to talk to?
So it was really simple. We are beholden to the organizations who are serving the customers to get contact information about the customers. So if that's a company, we will get a few thousand phone numbers of customers and then randomly sample within that, and obviously need to know what sort of coverage and comparison groups, et cetera, that they need. But that's really the main source of data that we use. We have done some pieces of work on populations where we are calling people who are not necessarily customers, and there we are using other people's databases. So Geopol and other organizations have access to people who have signed up and opted in. Actually, SurveyMonkey does this as well and said that they're happy to be surveyed. In those cases, you just have to be really aware of the quality of that group of people and how much it matches the people you want to study. And I would say, depending on the market that you're in, a lot of the markets that we're in, those things just don't exist. And then in other markets, they have great user panels, and in some markets, they have terrible user panels. But most of the time, what we're doing is getting the numbers from our clients.
Okay, makes sense. Rachel is wondering, have you ever encountered customers with survey fatigue? And if so, what are your tips for managing it?
It's interesting. We don't have the experience of calling people up often and they say, gosh, you're the 17th person who's called me with a study. So that doesn't seem to happen that much. I think that's probably, again, because we are getting, 5,000 phone numbers from a company that has 50,000 customers and sampling within that. But I think survey fatigue has to do everything with the length of the survey and the quality of the survey. So we spent a lot of time, again, in training of the people who are calling people up about making it conversational, making the opening really good, so that your experience is that you actually want to talk to this person, letting people opt in. Obviously, if somebody doesn't want to talk to us, they don't have to. And I think that rapport is hugely important in terms of response rate and hugely important in terms of quality of data. But ultimately, again, we're keeping people on the phone for 15 minutes. And as long as it's a conversation, that can pass pretty quickly, hopefully.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Let's see here. There's, quite a few questions kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of designing the surveys themselves, but maybe we'll come back to that after we cover some bigger picture questions again. So Ashish is wondering, how do you manage and compare the data you collect over the lifetime of an investment? So kind of getting back to the reporting side of things.
I guess I would sort of say, just like any other data that you would have over the lifetime of the investment, which may not be a satisfying answer. But again, ultimately, you have a thesis when you're deploying capital around what financial performance will look like and how it will evolve, what operational performance will look like and how it will evolve, and ideally what social performance will look like and how it will evolve. So what I would say, what happens in practice is we get data back many times, especially for investors, is the first time they have this type of data. And they have various, some of it is exactly what they expected. Some of it sharpens some of the things that they thought, and some of it is really surprising, right? And then over time, either as a company or as an investor, certain shifts will hopefully happen to improve the things they want to improve, maintain the things that are going well, etc. And so then over time, just like anything else, you want to see if the numbers are moving in the direction that you hope that they would move. And when they do or they don't, hopefully connect that back to things that have happened, things that you've done, changes that you've made. So I would say it's like any other data that we're getting back, where it's continuing to update your thesis on what's going to happen and continuing to see the interplay between actions that you take and whether or not the data evolves the way that you hope it would. And ideally, would really like to have it be the common practice that that social data is treated with that same level of thought and strategy as the operational and financial data that we're all used to having come in.
Mm-hmm. Great. So this might, kind of connect to what you said, but Angelica is wondering, when do you suggest you do this type of project? At what stage of the program or project? And similarly, Samyak is wondering what are the different data collection methods at different stages of an organization? So maybe if you can speak to kind of the evolution of lean data over the lifetime of a company's growth.
Well, it's interesting. What we see in practice happening is most of the people who are coming to us are people who have deployed capital, again, as grants or investments, who want to measure, so post-deployment of capital. I don't think the stage of the company and its evolution particularly matters. I mean, obviously, in a perfect world, you do everything from the beginning, but we don't live in a perfect world. So I would say that's the most common deployment right now. That said, we have, when we've been working with organizations, funds, etc., who have been gathering this data now with us for a few years, they've gotten to a point where they actually know what their metrics are supposed to look like. So whether that has to do with poverty focus or, net promoter scores, meaningfulness of impact, or specific metrics within a sector. And so in those cases, increasingly they're coming to us and saying, can you do a super short lean data survey as part of my diligence? Because I know where those headline indicators are supposed to be for me. And that's really a check to kind of see if overall this company is alignment or over or underperforming some of those core metrics. I think it's an excellent use case. I mean, the best way as a person deploying capital you can have more impact is to put your capital only against the things that are doing, from day one. So your decision not to invest is one of the more powerful things you can do, or to deploy capital in a case where you're on the fence. So I actually am very enthusiastic about that use case becoming much more common. And then again, just a little bit on this question of when and stage and different tools. I think that the tools you'll deploy in practice will be kind of what infrastructure you have access to. So if you bring an organization, a company like ours or somebody else, they will have infrastructure in place. If not, more often than not, you'll be limited by what's available to you. I would recommend almost always communicating with your customers or beneficiaries in the way that they're used to hearing from you. So if they get email from you all the time, email can be great. Your response rates won't be that high, but you can get really good data. If you're SMSing with them all the time or sending them WhatsApp messages, you can use that medium. So just kind of aligning with customer expectations and using this as a way to strengthen that relationship and deepen the conversation is ideal. But other than that, I would say there's no fundamental difference between, you have 100. I mean, we've literally had cases where, I remember, I think it was a Kenyan company, I believe it was in the irrigation space. And I think they had 150 customers. And one of the things that we always do now is we ask the company to predict the answers before we give them the data back, because that always engenders a much richer conversation. As human beings, we have an incredible tendency to say that whatever came back was exactly what we expected. And so what was really interesting about this case was even a company that was that small and that new and had that few customers, their thesis on how their product was being used was essentially incorrect out of the gate. They were still doing a good job and they had a great product, but they didn't actually understand why and how their customers were using it. So their entire sales pitch was not actually aligned with why customers were buying and the impact they're experiencing. So the word of mouth that was going on versus the company's sales pitch were just not connected. And it was really a grounding for me in terms of seeing how easy it is for any company, and I'm sure for ours as well, it is to lose touch with the pulse of your customer. from day one. So I can't say that earlier or later is better or worse. I think some way, shape, or form, that ongoing conversation with customers about everything that their experience is, including the social impact they're experiencing, the more that can be baked in a light touch way, the better.
Yeah, that's what I think is so appealing about the whole lean data approach, is how integrated it is with all of the other critical pieces of a venture, and keeping those messages in line with what people are actually thinking and experiencing, in addition to the actual measurement itself. So actually connected to that, Sensetta had a great question. How would you advise entrepreneurs develop a culture of measurement? How would you start building it into the venture from a team kind of culture perspective?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think in a way that's one of the most important things, and it's a lever that we don't really control, honestly. We can show up in the same way for 5 different companies, and the impact of the results will be all over the map. And it really does come down to culture. So I think I'm a really firm believer that we become good at whatever we do repeatedly. And so I think the only way to build a culture around the use of data to make decisions is to use data to make decisions. And I know that sounds like a truism, but I can't think of any other way to describe it. You're not going to one day make that shift. It has to be every single time you're gathering data at every moment. A person who I respect endlessly, Tulsi Ravilla, who is one of the founders of Aravind Eye Hospital, was actually on the Acumen board and was one of the people who helped us create lean data. Aravind Eye Hospital is one of the largest, most successful social enterprises in the world. They do cataract surgery for millions of patients. They are extremely data-driven organization, in addition to being extremely spiritual organization, but they have data everywhere. And they were so successful that more and more NGOs started to come to them to see if they could replicate what they do. And one of the things that Tulsi told me early on was what they found was that teaching people the techniques and helping them build the systems for data gathering was often the easy piece. But where their advisory and consulting work would succeed or fail was all about culture. And for organizations that didn't have that culture of using data to make decisions, no amount of data was going to actually help them reach the levels of efficiencies and productivity and social impact that they wanted. And for people who had that culture, the transformation was really profound. So it's more, that's not the how to build that, but more to underline that building that culture is the prerequisite for all of this to really take hold. And I would just really encourage whoever asked that question, and folks in general, to really take that culture piece really seriously, because otherwise you'll just have numbers floating around and will not be part of your organization's DNA to use them to make choices.
Great. I think that might be a good question to conclude on and wrap things up, because we're getting close to the hour. But there were several more questions. So just to let everybody know, sorry we can't get to everything, but we will be sending some links. Some people were asking in the chat, Sasha, for links to the reports that you mentioned. So we will connect you guys with that information. And I also put a note in, not that it's directly connected with lean data, but I personally can recommend Sasha's blog, because you touch on a lot of these concepts as well. And you mentioned the one that you shared today. So we'll send that link, that you published this week, related to the one number. And and just the last thing I'd add here, and you can share this afterwards as well, but if you want to know more specifically about what we're doing, you can go to this link, and that will allow us to get a hold of you and send any follow-up information in addition to whatever Danielle will be sending out. So feel free to do that. We'd love to hear from you. Yes, love it. And Natalie said, I was writing furiously, but would love to digest this in more detail. Yes, I imagine that there's lots more to cover here, especially if you guys are in the weeds of wanting to implement this kind of thing. So you will get the replay, so you can revisit the whole presentation and add those extra resources to your notes as well. Just to build off one more thing, which is that we mentioned the Lean Data course with Plus Acumen. It runs again in June 2020, so it's a little bit of a wait, but I just put up the information with the link if you want to sign up to get notified when it's open to register. in 2020, and you can work through a version of this material in a team with Plus Acumen as well. But obviously 60 Decibels has a ton more information and resources if you want to go even deeper. So anything else to add, Sasha, as we close?
No, not at all. Thank you all for joining. I hope the tech worked for everyone and they could see and hear, but if not, the replay will come. Thanks for your interest, and appreciate the chance to talk to you all.
Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. And
My
we'll
pleasure. Take care.
catch you all soon. Bye.